No one really noticed her at first. She was the kind of passenger you might see 100 times and never remember. Small frame, plain jacket, a leather-bound journal hugged close to her chest as though it were armor. She boarded late, the second to last to step onto Flight 417, sliding down the aisle quietly while other passengers wrestled with carry-ons and half-hearted complaints about overhead space. She didn't complain, didn't even glance around as if searching for anyone familiar. She simply took her seat by the window near the wing, buckled herself in, and pressed her forehead lightly against the glass. The hum of conversations filled the cabin, blending into the mechanical growl of the engines preparing for takeoff. Flight attendants smiled and checked seatbelts. Businessmen muttered about emails, children tugged on sleeves for snacks, and someone in row 12 was already asleep before the plane even left the ground. Amid it all, she was a shadow in plain sight, almost invisible. Her silence was so complete it seemed intentional, as though she carried within her an unspoken vow never to disturb the world around her. But there was something unusual if one paid close attention. Every now and then, her lips moved slightly, not in speech but in rehearsal, as though she was silently reciting lines, memorizing phrases no one else could hear. And her fingers tapped faintly on the cover of the journal, not with nervousness, but with rhythm, like she was keeping time with something only she knew. When the plane leveled above the clouds, the cabin lights dimmed, and the routine of travel settled in. Passengers dozed, read, or scrolled on glowing screens. The quiet passenger pulled her journal closer, opened it a fraction, and skimmed the words as if they weren't notes but codes, instructions too heavy for paper. For a moment, the world outside was only sky, endless and indifferent. Until the moment it wasn't. Gasps rippled across the rows when shadows appeared outside the windows. Sleek, sharp, metallic birds slicing through the sky, F-22 Raptors, their wings glinting like knives against the sunlight. They weren't escorting. They were circling, watching. The pilot's voice cracked through the intercom with forced calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We've been asked to maintain formation temporarily. Nothing to be concerned about." But the words carried a tremor no reassurance could mask. Everyone knew fighter jets didn't just appear beside commercial flights without a reason. The air shifted. Conversations stilled. Parents hushed their children. Even the constant hum of engines felt different now, heavier, charged with tension. The only one unmoved was the quiet passenger by the window. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask questions. She simply closed her journal, rested her palm on its cover, and lifted her head for the first time since boarding. Her eyes found the Raptors outside as though she had been waiting for them. And then, the impossible happened. A new voice crackled through the pilot's headsets, calm, steady, and commanding. It didn't come from the tower. It didn't come from the escorts. It came from her. The pilots froze when the voice broke through their comms. It was crisp, unmistakably clear, and layered with a kind of authority that didn't belong to any passenger on a commercial flight. "Raptor lead, stand down." The words came with coded inflection, a cadence trained into officers who had memorized the language of command. For a second, the pilots thought they had misheard, maybe a feedback loop, maybe a trick of interference. But then it came again, the same tone, sharper this time, as though it had cut straight through the invisible walls of protocol. The lead F-22 jolted slightly, its perfect formation wobbling before righting itself. That never happened. Fighter pilots drilled for years to erase hesitation from their bodies. Yet at that moment, both Raptors seemed to hesitate. The captain of Flight 417 turned pale, sweat prickling along his temples. He turned to his co-pilot, whispering low, "That's impossible. Did you hear it too?" The co-pilot nodded mutely, unable to process. He had spent his whole career listening to transmissions. He knew the difference between a prank, an interference, and a clearance code. What they had just heard was not only real, it was classified, buried in the kind of access most airmen would never hear in their entire lives. Inside the cabin, passengers pressed their faces to the glass. They could see the Raptors slowing, their sleek wings glinting as they held position. Murmurs rippled through the rows. Some thought it was an air show. Others whispered about hijackers. A mother clutched her child tighter, whispering prayers. The air was thick with dread and curiosity, every second stretching too long, too sharp. And then, the quiet passenger lifted her head. Her face was calm, her expression almost serene, but her eyes were focused, locked on the jets outside. The journal, once hugged to her chest like a shield, now lay idle on her lap, her hand resting atop it as though it were merely incidental. The tapping of her fingers had stopped. She no longer rehearsed, she was delivering. The captain switched frequencies frantically, trying to override, but every time he did, her voice cut cleanly back through. Confirm authentication. Alpha sequence, Echo 9. The language wasn't for passengers, wasn't even for ordinary pilots. It was the language of top-tier operations. A language no teenage girl should ever have known. The F-22s adjusted their altitude slightly, confirming the code. The pilots inside them didn't speak, not a single word, but their silence was louder than any roar of the engines. It was the silence of men who had just heard something they were never supposed to hear, from someone they were never supposed to obey. Inside the cabin, people were whispering now, louder, anxious. Who said that? Who's talking to them? A man in a business suit leaned forward to catch a glimpse of the girl near the wing, but her gaze never wavered. She wasn't hiding anymore. The Raptors held their formation, waiting, frozen. And for the first time since they had taken off, the power in the sky didn't belong to the fighter jets. It belonged to her. When the plane touched down, it didn't roll toward the usual terminal. Instead, ground crew waved it toward a far corner of the airfield, where floodlights glared down and dark SUVs lined up like chess pieces waiting for a move. Military personnel in black fatigues surrounded the runway, their presence as unmistakable as it was intimidating. Passengers craned their necks, cell phones already recording, voices rising in confusion. This isn't normal. Are we being detained? What's happening? The captain's voice came over the intercom, shaky but forced into control. Please remain seated. We'll be met by authorities for a brief check. Nothing to be alarmed about. But even as he said it, the lie was clear. He didn't know what was happening either. The Raptors that had shadowed them peeled away, banking into the clouds with eerie precision. Their absence didn't ease the tension, if anything, it made the silence heavier. Every passenger looked toward the woman by the window, the one who had never raised her voice until the sky itself listened. She didn't flinch at the soldiers outside. She simply closed her journal, slid the strap over it, and held it as if preparing for the next step of something she'd long anticipated. When the door opened, the air that rushed in wasn't just cool night, it was authority. Agents boarded swiftly, their eyes sweeping the cabin. No one dared speak. No one dared move. And then, as though drawn by an invisible signal, all eyes shifted to her. She rose without being asked. Not hurried, not nervous. Just certain. A young woman in an ordinary jacket, walking with the quiet calm of someone who had already chosen her role in a story much larger than the rest could imagine. Outside, flashes erupted, reporters, alerted by whispers of the escort, clustered behind barricades. The scene was chaos, questions shouted, cameras snapping, speculation pouring like floodwater. Who was she? A spy? A defector? A ghost from some classified file that had slipped into daylight? No one had answers. They only had her silence, and the fact that F-22 pilots had frozen at her command. Beyond the press, a man stood apart from the crowd. Tall, sharp-suited, the kind of presence that marked him as someone accustomed to boardrooms and power. The CEO. A single father who had once thought love could be purchased, that companionship could be ordered like a service to fill an emptiness he didn't know how to heal. He had built an empire of steel and glass, but he had never built a home. And yet here she was, his daughter, the quiet passenger, the one who had filled her silence with words written in journals, preparing for a future no one had scripted for her. He saw her step into the floodlights and realized she was no shadow. She had chosen her own path, and it was one that stretched beyond him, beyond business, beyond bloodlines. She didn't belong to his story. She was writing her own. And the world, stunned Raptors and all, would have no choice but to read it.